Good evening. I'm Marilyn Kushner, curator and head of the New York Historical Society's Department of Prints, Photographs, and Architectural Collections. Tonight, I look forward to speaking with all of you about our current exhibition, From Paul Revere to Edward Hopper, Treasures from the Leonard L. Milberg Collection of American Prints, Drawings, and Watercolors. Before this exhibition closes on October 27th, I'm excited to have the chance to dive into the highlights of this exhibition with all of you. I'd like to take a moment to thank our trustees, our chair's council, and all of our members and other generous donors. Your support allows New York Historical to continue to pursue our mission. Before we launch into our program, I want to let you know that it will last approximately 45 minutes, including 15 minutes for questions and answers at the end, which you can submit via the Q&A function on your Zoom screen at any point during the talk. We have disabled the chat function, so please do make sure to use Q&A. After the presentation, we will get to as many questions as time allows. Next slide, please. And the first thing I want to do is apologize. Linda Ferber will not be able to join us tonight, but she sends her best regards to everybody out there. I also want to thank Leonard Milberg, who has a great eye. He's a great collector and an exemplary historian. We could not have done this exhibition without his eye, and it's been our pleasure to be able to show part of his collection, which is extremely deep. I also have to say that this exhibition ranks as one of the favorites that I've done throughout my career. And I've done a lot of exhibitions, but I love this one because it's about history and it's about art, both of which I adore. And this is exactly what the Historical Society is all about. So without that, let's start. There will be 140 works on display from colonial times to the mid-20th century. Please come and see them all. We start with before the American Revolution, early Republic, and we end up in the mid to early 20th century. Could I have the first slide, please? We have various sections in our exhibition about which we call collector's choice. And those were things that Leonard really wanted to have in the exhibition and highlight them in one way or another. So these two pieces begin the exhibition. And it's on your left, you have a view of the Falls of Niagara in 1800. And on the right, you have a very famous Audubon turkey. The falls will appear again and again throughout this exhibition because they were one of the top places to see in America and Quebec, and Canada. And people went from everywhere all over to see them. If you look very closely at this, I don't know if you can see what I point out here. Down here is an indigenous group, and in front of them is a rattlesnake, which makes me believe that what this artist was doing was talking about what was going to happen in the future of the indigenous population, which was quite unfortunate. But here we see a piece that was done in 1800, and there was a lot of history to come before that and after that. And on the right is the Great American Turkey Cock that Audubon made in 1827. I have to say that the turkey was Audubon's favorite, and it is the first in his group of watercolors and prints that he produced. And it was also Benjamin Franklin's favorite, but Benjamin Franklin and Audubon lost out, and the eagle, the American eagle, the bald eagle became the symbol of America. Next slide, please. We start with views of the United States, or views of America, and the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And remember that we were basically we were all countryside. There were no cities at that point. And so the earlier prints that we're going to see are going to be prints of the cities themselves. So on the top, you see the panoramic view of Boston Harbor and part of Charleston with Bunker Hill, done in 1815. And this is taken from the point of view of Bunker Hill. But basically, the U.S. or America was made up of waterways, which were our highways. And so you see on the bottom a view of the first cities of the United States, including Philadelphia, Baltimore, Richmond, and New York. And it's because these cities were on rivers or on the ocean front. But you will also see in all of these cities church spires that are popping up all over the country and they seem to dominate a lot of the images that we see here. Next, please. On the left, we have Fitzhenry Lane's view of Boston Harbor, again, one of the major cities in the US at the time. And on the right, we have William James Bennett, New Orleans, taken from the opposite side, a short distance above the Picayune Ferry, 1841. So these were both done at in the same time period. So we are beginning to branch out with New Orleans. Everything is no longer on the eastern coast. So we have a time of expansion. But again, most things are waterways. Our highways were their waterways. And so most of the things that we see at this time period are going to be the great cities on the waterways. I also ask you to look at the image on the right because you see all of these little people and animals that are populating the images to give that one a sense of what the cities were like. Eventually, as we're going to see, artists will begin focusing on those people alone. Right now, they are just basically characters in the overall landscape views of the great city. Also, you'll see in many of these images the state houses of the cities and the states in which they are located, because again, those were the most important buildings at that time, and that is perfectly clear in what you see on the right in the New Orleans view with the state house smack dab in the middle of the image. Next, please. As America grows, we go west. And so on the left, we see the city of Detroit. Detroit was at that time the first capital of Michigan, and this was done in 1837, the year that Michigan joined the United States. You can see the important buildings in the background, but again, it's the same almost, it's a coda of the city in the background and the waterway or the highways in the center, and the people populating the front and in the foreground. Again, showing you that there was a lot of still undeveloped countryside in these images and next to these cities, which would by now we know has become totally populated and built with buildings on each side of the rivers and taking first view of them. And on the right, not far, it's 1857. This is the mid-19th century, where a lot of the cities on the East Coast have been built up. Los Angeles is just starting out. And so we have this, this image of Los Angeles with all of the type of architecture that is found out there, exhibited on the outside borders of this. Notice the date again, that it is in the mid-19th century, and people are trying to go west at this time, and it won't take long before America grows and Los Angeles itself grows up. But again, you can see that these pictures and these prints were a way that the population could understand and know what was going on around them. Remember, photography doesn't really become popular until the mid-19th century. And so the dispersion of prints is the way people found out what the country looked like and who were the important people in our country. And we'll get to that in a few minutes when we start looking at some of the portraits. Next, please. This is historic American prints from the colonies. On the left, we have an extremely important print by Carl Witham called the View of Fort George with the city of New York. And you can see this is a very, very, very early, done in the early 18th century. We know that it is, and you can also see the British flags flying high, not only above the city, but also above the boats in the water. Again, a way to establish representation of the fact that this was a British colony. And you see also Fort George on the shore in the background. That's the tip of Manhattan, which obviously looks quite a bit different these days. And also another very important part of this is all of the churches that have sprouted up in not a very long time since the first settlers came here. So that again became an important part of the skyline of any early city. And on the right, we have Te-ne-hoga-ro, who was the emperor of the Six Nations. This is a print that was done in 1710, and it was done on the occasion of Te-ne-hoga-ro's visit to England, where he met with Queen Anne and he gave her the wampum belt, which was a symbol of peace that you see he holds in his right hand. He also is accompanied by a wolf, which was his animal. It was an animal that he was identified with. And what you might have noticed is that he is not in indigenous wear, he is in Western wear. And that is because he was taken over to England by some of the settlers here, and they dressed him in their Western clothes. Later, other indigenous chiefs would go over to England, only they would be wearing their own types of clothing, not what we see here, which is an indigenous man dressed up in Western clothing. So at this point, we're still a colony, and can I have the next slide, please? A lot of the portraits that are in this exhibition are prints after paintings. And if one remembers, and I try to tell this to young kids when I take them through, obviously it's quite obvious. There were no computers then. There was no TV then. There was no photography then. And so the way that people found out what their leaders looked like was through prints. And so most of these prints that were in the exhibition, were done after famous paintings. And here you see a portrait of George Washington. These prints were sold for very cheaply on the streets of the cities. And as I said, it was a way that people could identify with who was leading the country. And on the left is the bloody massacre that was done in 1770. It's called the Bloody Massacre, perpetuated in King Street in Boston. And when I do this, whenever I show this print, I pop a few bubbles because it shows that Paul Revere, who is revered in our history, was a plagiarist. And that's because his nephew, Henry Pelham, took this print to Paul Revere to get his ideas on the organization of the print and how Pelham had done it. And he wanted feedback from Paul Revere. Paul Revere took that image, and 3 days later, he published it under his name. And so when I did the labels for this exhibition, I wrote that Paul Revere was the printer and Henry Pelham was the artist. It was an incident that occurred in Boston in 1770, where a number of schoolboys were playing around. It was winter. They started to throw snowballs at 1 or 2 sentries that were positioned outside this building you see on the right. There were not this many soldiers and in the square at the time, although I will say that there were almost only twice as many colonists in Boston as there were the British Army. So there was a lot of British Army in Boston at that time, but there were not that many officers when this whole incident began. You also see Crispus Attucks, who was the first an African-American Black man to lose his life in the Revolutionary War. And he is, I can't point it out, or maybe I can. I don't know if anybody can see my pointer, but you can see him next to the man in red, who's on the left side, right next to him. So this is an important print for so many different reasons. Eventually, the soldiers were put on trial, and the person who represented them was John Adams, who felt that they deserved, that even the British soldiers deserved a fair trial. And I find that a very interesting and poignant way to point out at that point in our history how even then people getting fair trials was of utmost importance to the colonists. Next slide, please. All right, so let's talk about some of the cities. On the left, we have Broadway from Bowling Green, done in 1834. It's past the Revolution, but it was right here at Bowling Green that the statue of King George was torn down on July 9th, 1776, and the New York Historical Society has the tail of that horse that he was on. So this means something to us because Historical Society has a part of what is going on in this area years before. Also, you can notice that I will tell you that George Washington at first lived in the house on the far left of this photograph, of this print. And then if you count in 4 buildings, that's where he lived at this time when the revolution began. Obviously, then he left New York when the British came into New York. But until then, George Washington was living in the house on the far left. After he became the president, he lived in the house that is the 4th from the left. On the right, we have Caillots's view of the Great Fire in New York, which occurred in 1836. And I have to admit that as a child growing up in Chicago, I was always shown the Chicago Water Tower, and this was when the Great Chicago Fire burned, and everything south of that burned down. And I thought that the biggest fire in the country at that time was in Chicago. But I quickly learned that there were massive fires in most cities at this time because of the fact that fires and hot coals were used for light. And so oftentimes there would be huge fires. This fire burned down nearly half of the First Ward. It destroyed a lot of the business district. And somebody who was keeping a diary at that time wrote that nearly half of the First Ward is in ashes. The night was intensely cold and the water froze in the hydrants, which was why that fire raged on and on. I might add that was not just somebody, it was Philip Hone, whose diaries we have at the New York Historical Society. And so we have to keep in mind that a lot of these great cities did burn, but were rebuilt even better after that. I also want to point out again what I showed you in a previous slide, which you see all these little people populating on the left. They're populating the streets. There are no pigs in the streets in this image of New York, although many of us know that pigs roamed wild in the streets before garbage collectors began routine kit pickups. But you see that the people just become little incidentals in these early images. That will change in the mid-19th century. Next slide, please. With an artist like Caillots, who is also the artist who made the print that I just showed you of the Great Fire in New York. On the left, you see the straw man, who is a freed slave living now in New York City. Slavery ended in New York City in 1827. And this really gives this man, the straw man, a sense of purpose and a real sense of respect for what he was doing as somebody a freed slave working in New York in the mid-19th century. And on the right, also by Caillots, is the barroom lounges in the 1840s, a place where men would go to read the newspaper and lounge. Notice there are no women in here. And this would change, but not for a long time. But it's this idea of the men going into what were lounges. And that's where they would find the local newspapers and lounge quite a bit, looks like quite comfortably in this space, reading the newspapers. The next slide, please. And here we have two maps. And maps are a very important part of Leonard Milberg's collection. And he has so many important ones. We couldn't show nearly all of them. We did put these 2 maps are among the few that we were able to put into the exhibition. On the left is the earliest published image of the Revolutionary War that was published in July 1775. And if you can look at a blow up, you can see where all the British cavalry is. You can see where the road down which Paul Revere wrote and said the British are coming, because this was what was happening at the time. But you would also notice that the British greatly outnumbered the colonists at this time. That would change before not too long when the colonists won the Revolutionary War. And on the right, we have what is called the Thomas Longworth map. Again, a very, very important map. It is at this time, and you can see if you look really closely at the map, and I don't think we can get a blow up of it right now. but this was the time when Lafayette Street was named after Lafayette in 1825 and published in 1825 when Lafayette was here. And so it's a very important map because of the fact that it shows a lot of comparative plans here, but also shows Lafayette Street marked out in it. And what I also ask you to notice is how many of these streets were laid out at this time. And it was only it was only in the early 19th century, and the city had not expanded this far yet, and yet these streets have been laid out at this time and had been done on earlier maps as well. So this map itself has been inscribed to General Lafayette for when he was here in the 1820s. Next slide, please. The landscape starts changing as we go into the 19th century, and here you see the Palisades in the Hudson River, part of the very famous Palisade portfolio. And on the right, you have burning the fallen trees. And I always used to wonder how they got those trees down. They didn't just chop them down. They girdled them, which meant that they stripped them of the bark and let those trees die. It took a couple of years before the trees died, but then they were able to take them down and clear the forests. So the forests are being cleared and the quarries are being quarried, and the U.S. is growing in size by the mid-19th century. And this really shows us how the landscape is going to change. The only place from which you can see the quarries as they look like here, you can still see some of those quarries in that state. And those are the ones that you can see from the cloisters, because Rockefeller owned that land and he made sure to buy up the land across from the cloisters to keep it unquarried. But if you go across the George Washington Bridge, which I do all the time because I live out in New Jersey, there you can see that the rest of those Palisades have been quarried and are gone now. The next slide, please. See how time is coming along? Okay. Here we have a picturesque countryside. On the left is Sunnyside, which was the home of Washington Irving, which he purchased in 1835. Irving enlisted George Harvey, who you see did the piece on the right, but on the left, this was done by John Henry Hill. But Harvey was enlisted to renovate this farmhouse. It became a well-known dwelling, which stands today as a place that people will go and see it as it was back then. On the right, we have George Harvey's Central Park done in 1870. And this is a very important image. It's a beautiful watercolor. So we're going from prints only to watercolors are taking over as well in terms of showing us what was going on at that time. And this was done during the competition that was being held for Central Park and the layout of Central Park. The competition began in 1857, but Central Park was not completed until 1876, which is after this watercolor was made. What some people might not know is NYHS owns 3 entries. There were 36 entries of Central Park. 5 still exist and are known today. And of those 5, we have 3 of them. And so that's one of the great treasures that we have that have been exhibited occasionally, and a number of them were exhibited just a few years ago. Next, please. We're getting now into the from the early 19th century, as you see here on the left, into the mid-19th century. And in the early 19th century, this is probably pictured from the Palisades Hudson River, from Fort Tyrone Park, which is where the cloisters are. But you can see it is an area that has clearly had some trees leveled as these figures look out over the landscape, which at one time was just full of trees, and already those are being cut down for homes that would go out right in those areas. On the right, we have a John William Hill still life with pears and plums, and it's really very related to the pre-Raphaelites after John Ruskin, who at this time in England was espousing the idea of truth to nature. And so this watercolor really does try to give an idea of truth of nature, but if you look closely at it, it has been somewhat composed. This is not how all of these fruits would fall onto the ground, but they have been arranged to make a better composition. But it's this whole general idea of painting nature as one sees it and not nature's as one might like to see it. So we have these ideas going from the macro on the left to the micro on the right, and to these beautiful, beautiful watercolors that were being done by Americans at this time period in the mid-19th century. Next, please. Two more images from Collector's Choice, and these were images that we really wanted to put in the exhibition, and that Leonard especially wanted to be in the exhibition, and they didn't tie in quite as much with some of the other images that we have. In certain ways we could have put them there, but we really wanted parts of this exhibition to show his choice of the pieces that were important to him. So on the left, you see John Henry Will and William James Bennett, New York, from Brooklyn Heights, 1837. It's one of my favorite prints in the show, because if you look very closely, you can see, I don't know if you can see my pointer, but if you can, in the very foreground, we have people in Brooklyn, and they're looking over here, the East River. And then you see beyond the East River, you see Manhattan, and you see the buildings of Manhattan here. And then beyond there, you can see the Hudson River, and you can even see the heights of New Jersey. So there are 5 levels of this image, really showing you what New York looked like in the 1830s and 1840s, and the whole New York area, including New Jersey, again, my home state, New Jersey. And on the right, we have a Robert Havell panoramic view of Venice, which really does tie into a history of American history at this time, United States history, because this was the time when a lot of the very wealthy Americans were taking their grand tours, especially the young men. Eventually the young women would be taking them too, but in the beginning it was just the young men who would take a grand tour for a year throughout Europe. And one of the most popular stops on that grand tour was Venice itself. But these cities were beginning to see great classes of cities, New York on the left and Venice on the right, but this idea of the rise of a civilization in America that was going to equal the civilizations in Europe. Next, please. On the left, these are 2 political images, and Linda and I decided it would be very apropos to have political images in the exhibition right now. On the left, it's about Mexican news that is arriving, news about the Mexican War. And in this, you see they're reading what has happened. It's the end of the war when the U.S. received Texas territory, and there were feelings that this expansion of territory would affect the slave trade. On the bottom, you do see 2 slaves looking in. They can't read. They are on the outside of this unit of people that are up on the porch. Notice they're higher than the slave and the child. And in the background, if you look very closely, beyond the pillar in the upper background, you see a woman. There were not very many women in these political images. On the right, you see another image of another vote, the verdict of the people, done just a few years later after the Woodville. And again, there are no women in this photograph, in this print, but if you look very, very closely, you can see the women in this balcony looking down on the men who were either not happy with the vote or joyous because of the vote that was being reported. This was a time where anti-slavery was becoming a very important topic. It's right before the Civil War, so we were going to go to war about this. And this is a time that was also very pro-temperance. And so this was quite a difficult time in the history of this budding nation. Next, please. We're getting to a time period now where lithography is developed. It was invented in Germany in the late 18th century. It comes here in the early 19th century, but by the middle 19th century, we have a lot of lithographs that are being made. Again, remember, all of these prints that we're seeing are the ways that people would understand what was going on. It was the pictures they were able to see because of the fact that we didn't have any other instruments that were where people were able to know what the news was and what it might have looked like. So on the left, we have the Rocky Mountain immigrants crossing the plains, Fanny Palmer, who worked for Courier and Ives. And this is a time when these lithographs, full of information about how we were settling the West and what was going on in the Midwest and what the Moors were and whatever, all about American life. It was being transmitted through many of these prints that were being sold at a price that people could afford. And on the right, we have people skating in Central Park, Winslow Homer, 1861. Again, before the final park was laid out, but the competition for Central Park really directed that the people who were giving us, trying to design Central Park, and they were doing their competition drawings, they had to include a reservoir, they had to include a place for the horses, and they also had to include a skating rink like you see here. So it's not unusual that you would see skating in Central Park dated 1861 before the park was finished. The next slide, please. We're getting into the Gilded Age now, the 1880s. I don't know if you can read Fidela Bridges' Carnations and Geranium, 1870s. So we have two images here, macro versus micro, but as I said, beginning to reflect the Gilded Age, a time when a lot of money was being made, and a lot of industrialists were accumulating great fortunes, taking those grand trips to Europe with the women at that time as well, and buying portraits, buying art in Europe, and having their portraits made by Sargent or any of the other society painters at the time. But we also have smaller pieces or less important pieces or not great portraits like I just talked about. But this, the Newman on the left, for those of you who have seen the exhibition, this is a huge work, and it is a beautiful, beautiful work. And it was the type of thing that some people who might have had a lot of money would have paid for something like this, where the Fidela Bridges is much smaller, but it shines in itself. These are a time when a lot of the work that was being done here in the US was tied in with the pre-Raphaelite, where we see the Gilded Age and American pre-Raphaelites. The pre-Raphaelite movement was one that really was insisting upon truth to nature. It was about John Ruskin, who said, as I might have said to you before, paint nature as you see it, not as you would define, not as you would lay it out yourself. And you see this kind of an idea of truth of nature, truth to nature, on a much smaller scale, so that people who might not have had the money of the great industrialists could also buy important pictures, which is what they call these watercolors, and hang them in their homes. The next slide, please. The Gilded Age and the American pre-Raphaelites, as I just was talking about the pre-Raphaelites. This is post-Civil War. The Gilded Age also came with it a new cosmopolitanism, which I talked about in terms of traveling over to Europe, in terms of building these huge homes that lined Fifth Avenue at the time, and really showed the opulence and beauty that was achieved and was really desired by many people who could afford it. And then you have something like the Bierstadt, who's known for these great paintings of the Far West. And you get this very delicate little butterfly, which was done, he would paint one side of it, fold it over, and then open it, and it would be a butterfly. He'd give this out as party favors, but it's the idea for art's sake. It became a monument, a monoprint, and was a party favor that he gave away at various occasions when he would have people over at his house. And then on the right, you see some beautiful Mary Cassatt, a beautiful Mary Cassatt print. She was French trained. She was a child of the Gilded Age, but she went over to Paris and she worked over there with a lot of the great artists in the late 19th century working there. She was trained by them. This is from a great print series that she did in the 1890s, the banjo lesson. And again, the child, because she was a child of the Gilded Age, she really shows a lot of these Gilded Age types of activities that were going on. But we're getting into a point now where art isn't always as a vehicle to communicate with people in terms of what your country looked like or what was happening, but it became art for art's sake alone. And that was all part of the idea of opulence and beauty of the Gilded Age when these great fortunes were being built. Next, please. Now we're getting into the late 19th, the early 20th century. You have a rise of the middle class here. And so you have images that are going to relate to the middle class. You have Prendergast at the Park, Telegraph Hill, Secret. This is San Francisco. It's not New York, but Leonard bought this while we were arranging for this show, and we all agreed that it had to be in the exhibition because it is a gorgeous painting, but it is also a real important indication of what the middle class might have done on a Sunday afternoon. It reminds one of the Grand Jacques, and so we decided that this had to be in the exhibition. And then you see the Jerome Myers in the middle on 9th Avenue. You have the middle class who this is their way of leisure. They're not going to the grand parks all the time, but they're on the streets with their children congregating. And so this is a time when you can see all these different class the differences of the way people were living at the time. And then the artists who were painting, they were painting the middle class. They were painting the lower class at this time. And on the right, you see the Stuart Davis, a man who's gesturing. The waiter is trying to give him a napkin. And the man doesn't quite understand what it's like to go out to a restaurant at this time. And so he says, take that rat away. I ain't going to wrap this up. I'm going to eat it right here. He doesn't know that he was being offered a napkin. But what I like about this is the woman that he's with. It's 1913. And the women were just starting to go out into public. They were just starting to go into restaurants at this time. So you can talk about this in terms of the rights of women. And I was very delighted at one point when I was watching Downton Abbey that there was one of the characters, one of the young women, was in a restaurant, and it was 1913, 1914, and she looked at the man she was with, and she said, oh, how wonderful this is. Can you imagine 5 years ago, I couldn't be at a restaurant with you. So this is a real turning point in terms of the way people congregated. And again, a way of telling history, which we're interested in, but telling it through these great images. Next, please. Modern Life and the Eight. The Eight was a group of very important painters working here in America in the early 20th century. On the left, John Sloane's Cross Showers, 1926. And the man is saying he really wanted to buy this work of art that is in front of him. The client is standing up and his wife is next to him. And he said, but I don't know if I can afford it because my wife wants a new fur coat. And so again, this idea of class coming into this, going out to the galleries and buying the paintings or the fur coats, whoever wins out in this dispute. And on the right, you have the window shopping. It's by Everett Shinn, and it's called The Hat Shop, done in 1904. And this woman is window shopping, and she necessarily might not be able to afford those hats. But again, it's this idea of being able to go out and perhaps buy them, but oftentimes not being able to buy them. And then finally, the next two, please. The Great Hopper, Night on the L. How could we do an exhibition of Leonard's collection without having this in here? This is one of the famous hoppers. Again, people going out into the streets, showing all levels of society, and you see that also in Bellows Counting Out on the right, 1921, very close in time to Night on the L Train, and it's another side of what is happening in the middle class at this time. So you're telling a story now. We go from, these are the last two slides, but we go from, remember, the beginning of showing the wilderness, and then we go into showing the cities, and then we go into the development of the cities and how we went west, so that this exhibition follows the history of America from when it was first discovered and when it was first occupied by the British and the indigenous groups that really came on the short end of the stick in those years when they lost their lands, now to the 20th century, where we're talking about the classes and in the settled cities, and the settlement of America and the development of the United States. So we end with that. This is a tip of the iceberg of Leonard's great collection, but we were thrilled to be able to show these. And again, I will say this is one of my favorite exhibitions that I've done because it's full of history and it's full of amazingly great works of art on paper. So if you haven't seen it, please come because it's coming down soon at the end of October. Thank you. Okay, first question. Can you speak on how you, Linda, and Mr. Milberg decided on the title of the exhibition? It's a very long title, granted, but we wanted to highlight the fact that this was Leonard's exhibition that he has been putting together for decades, but also the idea that he is a historian and that it was going to tell the history of what has gone on in the United States. So it was back and forth. It's a long title, but we decided to keep it that way because it really describes what people are going to see on the inside. Anything else? Can you speak about the advent of the daguerreotype process in general? Daguerreotypes became popular here in the mid-19th century. We have an amazing daguerreotype collection. And for the first time, and I think that's an important question, because for the first time, people had to sit for a very long time without moving because the camera was not yet developed enough to be able to take a quick photo shot of it. But it was the first time where people were able to have their portraits taken and keep them as memos and keepsakes. So that was in the mid 19th century that happened. I don't know if I've answered that question well enough, but next question. Is this exhibition set to be on view anywhere else after closing at NYHS? No, it is not. Next question. Oh, okay. Are we done? If nobody else has any questions, I will end by saying that it's been a great time. It's been fun to show you these. I would love it if you all could see it if you haven't seen the exhibition, because it is such an educational experience, not only for in terms of art, but in terms of history as well. Thank you so much for your participation and for your exceptional support of the New York Historical Society. We also hope you can join us in the museum, as I keep saying, to see this great collection before it leaves on October 27th, which is around the corner. I hope you've enjoyed your evening, and thank you for being here.